Hello! So this week we have a couple different lectures. This first one is pretty short, and I just want to briefly talk about some of the Enlightenment ideas, and then also a little bit about the First Great Awakening. And so these are two things that do influence what happens in the colonies. Just really quickly gonna give some background on this. So the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that started in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the colonies, it mainly took hold in the 18th century, so a little bit later on to get going over in the colonies. And the Enlightenment revolved around ideas concerning God, nature, reason, humanity, and this created some revolutions in thought, so like philosophy and politics, and then also in art. And they really stress the power of human reason to promote human progress. So there are a lot of sort of theoretical laws based on society and nature. And some of the big thinkers that you probably heard of in the Enlightenment, we have Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Voltaire. John Locke is mainly the one that's going to influence a lot of American Revolution ideas. So he's really one of the ones you want to pay a lot of attention to. So rational humanity is one of these ideas, and that means, we have the definition here. Humans understanding their universe and using that understanding to improve their own condition. And so we have these three main concepts: knowledge, freedom, and happiness, and those are all tied together in rational humanity. Okay, so here are some quotes from the time that I just kind of want you to pay attention to, because you can see that a lot of these were some dangerous ideas to be saying at the time. So the first one: those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That's Voltaire. And then we have Descartes: because reason is the only thing that makes us men and distinguishes us from the beasts, I would prefer to believe that it exists in its entirety in each of us. So that, a little bit of a sarcastic comment saying, not everybody is using reason. We have Kant: I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. As you might imagine, that was a very controversial thing to say then, kind of saying that faith ignores or is outside of intelligence. You have to kind of get rid of some of your intelligence to have faith. So that was certainly a scary thing to say at that time. And then Benjamin Franklin: whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. So these are all interesting quotes, and that you could argue that these are very much applicable today in the 21st century. So just kind of mull those over. All right, Benjamin Franklin is sort of the Enlightenment man of the colonies. And you may know some things about him already. Usually when I ask, people say, oh, the kite and the key. So he did do experiments, scientific experiments. And he did some experiments with air currents. And in doing that, he invented a new stove to heat homes more efficiently. He did his electricity experiments, as we know. And one of the big things that came out of those experiments was lightning rods. So those were used to channel electricity away from buildings and protect them so they wouldn't catch fire in a storm. Some other inventions of Benjamin Franklin's: bifocals, rocking chairs, the American penny. This musical instrument that you see him playing here is called an harmonica. It's like a harmonica without the H. And the idea there was, if you take like water around the rim of a glass, it makes a noise. And he made a musical instrument based on that concept. And he also invented a flexible catheter, which is interesting because that means there were catheters that were not flexible. It's a terrifying thought. He was also heavily involved in politics, as you may know. One of the founding fathers. He was very much responsible for foreign policy in the early United States, and he did work on the Declaration of Independence. One thing you may not know about Benjamin Franklin was that he was definitely a ladies' man. He, in his personal journal, wrote something like, how he had a weakness for the lowest sort of woman, and the ladies were just super attracted to Benjamin Franklin, I'm guessing for his brain. Established universities and the postal system. One thing I want you to take note of is that he was never president. A lot of people kind of assume that he was president at one point, and he was not ever president. Okay, so we're going to talk more about Ben Franklin as we progress through this course, but I just kind of wanted to introduce you to him. Here we have some of the effects on religion of the Enlightenment. So colleges initially in the colonies focused heavily on religious studies, and because of the Enlightenment they started focusing more on things like math and science, medicine, law, different studies outside of religion. And then in addition to that, we have this concept of rational Christianity that pops up. Does the existence of a creator that gives everyone salvation, but that God's greatest gift is reason. And so people are kind of given, you know, their own direction for how they want to lead their life. So it's up to people to use reason to reach this ideal of what God could give you. Deism, a lot of the founding fathers are said to have held deistic views, so Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and basically that means that God was the creator, but then everything after that was sort of in the hands of nature and humans. So not necessarily that God is intervening in the daily lives of people. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say about the Enlightenment as far as it concerns us in this class. So we're going to go on and talk about the First Great Awakening now. And this was a religious revival in the colonies. So in the 1730s in New England and also middle colonies, so like New York and Pennsylvania, is when this started. It was a period of intense religious piety. The Protestant churches started expanding and fractioning into different groups. And we have ministers that went around preaching evangelical messages. So experiencing new birth through religious conversion, so trying to convert more people to their certain brand of Protestantism. And there was an emphasis on preaching. Unlike the Catholic Church, where there was a lot of ritual and a lot of wealth in the church, they're focusing on what they're saying. So the guy you see here in this painting, his name is Jonathan Edwards. He was one of the first preachers of this Great Awakening. And he really got people excited. So he would preach really excitedly about God's grace and how great it was, but then he would also preach like about terrifying damnation. So it was a very theatrical performance. And a lot of these Great Awakening ministers would be very theatrical. Especially George Whitfield, who you see here. Between 1739 and 41, he went on a tour of the colonies. So he was from England, and he came over to the colonies. He started in New England, worked his way all the way down to Georgia, going on this tour. And he was, like, they said that he was so electrifying that people would weep, they would shriek, they'd start fainting. He was just a very excited guy, very theatrical. And he was ignoring church boundaries, which threatened local clergy. And so he would travel around outside preaching to people, kind of ignoring traditional boundaries of where churches, where people would attend church, and a lot of the local ministers were unhappy with that. So we do have this split in the clergy of New England. So the old lights are the people who liked doing things the old way, so respecting those boundaries, preaching indoors, not super into this evangelical, theatrical performance that's going on. And then we have the new lights, who are the people that are a fan of this, that are a part of this Great Awakening, and they really like what's going on. So we do have some controversy with that. These traveling sermons, these people really start doing these, I guess you could call them copycat performances. So there are a lot of people after George Whitfield that start doing the same thing. And they just travel around the countryside, around the towns, preaching outdoors, More and more people are sort of abandoning the traditional services that they had been going to. We have new churches that started popping up all over, and because, you know, the traditional ministers, traditional churches, and then these new lights, the new churches, they were at odds, and so there were actually a few sort of scrapes they got into. One example in particular is that some Presbyterians went to some Anglican churches and started like setting loose pack of dogs in the middle of a service, just to disrupt the service, which was kind of funny. And the Baptist ministers who took part in that did end up getting imprisoned and fined. But we have like actual sort of attacks going on churches. So the new lights and the old lights were very confrontational. And so we do have a fractioning of society because of these two concepts that I talked about, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. So, you know, we kind of have talked about other rebellions that have popped up and how those were fractioning society. So like frontier people versus city people, or black people versus white people, or rich versus poor, and all these things. But now you can add another layer onto that. So people who are more science-y or people who are more religion-y. And so that definitely adds to the mix of what's going to happen when the revolution pops up. So just keep that in mind. I told you this first one would be pretty short. I just wanted to add a layer in for what was going on in society. So we will pick this up with the next lecture, which is on the imperial crises that take place in the colonies, with all these different acts that England is levying on the colonies, and good stuff. So take a break, get some caffeine. I'll see you back in a moment.